much smaller than the original forecast of 6%. It just shows the strength of the actual fiscal position. And it's also worth noting that the investment income, if you look at, say, Hong Kong's budget, land sales are taken above the line. That is, the proceeds of land sales are considered government revenue. In Singapore, land sales are below the line. They're not considered part of government revenue. They are a financing item. Now, this actually means that not just land sales, but all investment income is taken below the line. So the actual fiscal position is much stronger if you look at it the way Hong Kong does or the way most of the rest of the world does. If you look at the IMF definition of the fiscal balance, then Singapore's fiscal position is actually a lot stronger. Which basically means that, when I hear this argument that if the corporate tax cannot go down because then you're going to have to increase some other tax, and particularly GST, as Ee Loong quite nicely pointed out, the GST is a much more buoyant tax. The vibrancy of tax buoyancy is much greater with GST. If it goes up, the actual revenue from that goes up much more than the equivalent reduction in corporate tax. So I don't think there is a need for an equivalent increase, certainly in GST. And in my view, there's no need for any GST at all in Singapore because the simple fact is that the actual fiscal position is so much stronger, and Singapore has one of the highest savings rates in the world. The GST, of course, is a tax on consumption. So I've always opposed the GST. Ever since I came here, I have been an opponent of the GST. Whenever I get a chance to tell the government, I always say this. But of course, it has definitely fallen on deaf ears for 15 years. But the point is that there is no need for a GST given Singapore's fiscal position. But of course, Singapore prefers to have a very, very robust fiscal balance, and therefore, corporate tax rate will, if anything, stay around these levels or maybe slightly low over a long period of time. But I don't think it's about to come down. But I think there is a good argument for the top rate of income tax to be equalized with the corporate tax.
Ee Loong?
Well, the last statement, but for Basu, he has vested interest, so we have to discount that a little. Now we have to bear in mind that the minister has indicated that the 17% is not completely fixed. He has predicated his announcement by saying that we will always want to remain competitive. So we always look at Hong Kong as a competitor. So now Hong Kong is 16.5. So in fact, I have clients asking me, well, is it likely that Hong Kong will move down to 15? Because if Hong Kong moves down to 15, then a 2 percentage point is a bit substantial. My take is Hong Kong will not move down to 15 because if it moves down to 15, it has to implement GST because it has to make up for revenue. And those of you who remember 3 years ago when Donald Tsang floated the idea of implementing GST, you have 100,000 people marching to Governor's House. So in fact, my Hong Kong clients ask me, when your minister proposed to increase to 5%, from 5 to 7%, how come you all have no demonstration? So I said, well, in Singapore, we have Changi Prison. And if Basu keeps insisting, he may go there.
Thank you, Ee Loong. Okay, so from Changi Prison, let's move on to a four-letter word that some companies don't like. This four-letter word is LEVY, levy, the foreign worker levy. Government has increased the foreign worker levy for the work permit holders as well as the S-Pass holders. And of course, this is going to be affecting the more of the labor-intensive enterprises or businesses. There's of course going to be a double whammy. In July, the jobs credit scheme ends. So Anna, maybe a question for you. What industries will be particularly affected and what can they do to mitigate the impact of these, this increasing labor costs, so to speak?
Well, as Yilung says, businesses, if they can employ less people, they will do so. Well, I'm not sure about the effect of the foreign workers levy. I think the current thinking is that the impact will be on some of the sectors like your retail, your construction, sectors that really require quite a fair amount of foreign labor. On the other hand, we are hoping that the Productivity and Innovation Credit scheme would, to a certain extent, alleviate part of the increase in foreign workers levy. Because the intent is that if you're able to put in place, I mean, there's the 250% for investments in automation equipment, hopefully some of these investments would actually go a long way to reducing, to minimizing the need for increase in labor and increase in workforce as businesses increase and pick up over time. We are hoping that PIC would, to a certain extent, alleviate some of the foreign workers levy hike and increases. Well, that's.
Thank you, Anna. Gentlemen, any? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think the timing of the increase in the foreign worker levy is also quite cyclically appropriate, given the fact that the construction boom that occurred over the last 3 years is largely over. If you look at construction contract awards, they've really weakened very sharply in the last 12 months. In fact, they're declining sharply now. So the construction boom is over. Construction is the one sector that really employs foreign workers by the thousands. I mean, Bangladesh is benefiting a huge amount from this. Lots of worker remittances going back to Bangladesh. But from a social perspective as well, there is, I think, a need for limiting perhaps the extent of dependence on foreign workers. So now that the construction boom is over, there will in any case be a reduced need for foreign workers, but increasing the levy, I think, is actually a very small burden, which is offset, I completely agree, it's offset by the automation incentive in particular. And I would say, if anything, the construction sector is one that probably needs to pay a little bit more attention to innovation and automation, rather than simply using foreign workers to meet the needs of the industry over time. But I think to some degree it also applies to retail and hospitality, where the dependence on foreign workers has, if anything, increased over time. Now, if you look at the pace at which employment has grown during the construction boom, net employment in the year 2008, net employment growth in Singapore was about 8.5%. 8.5% growth in employment in an economy like this, which is really one of the most developed economies in the world with one of the highest per capita incomes, is astonishing. And when I tell my American clients that at the peak of this global recession, at the worst point in the global recession, the unemployment rate in Singapore was a princely 3.3%. Their jaws dropped. 3.3% unemployment is something that the US economy did not achieve at the peak of its last boom. And in fact, that's true of Europe, of course, even more so. So the point is that the flexibility of the labor market is, of course, enhanced by the presence of foreign workers. But the fact, the jobs credit, I think, did a great job of providing a sufficient incentive for employers not to lay off people at the worst point in the recession. Now, there's a little bit of a burden being placed on employers to ensure that they invest a bit more on R&D and automation and depend a little less on foreign workers. I don't think it's too much of a burden to ask for.
Yeah. Okay, let me just